For being here again. I wanted to start by reminding you that what we talked about last time was trauma and its impact on our brains and our bodies, and to give you the opportunity to share with me if you had questions about that, and or questions or thoughts about what we talked about last time, and or to share with the group if there are ways in which the information that you learned last time has impacted the work that you've done. Are there ways that you've been holding this in your work, as you have approached the sacred work that we all are doing over the last month? I think that we're actually seeing even another increase in the impatience and irritability and general nastiness, though that may be too strong a word. Now that there is even an increase in the sense of I have to take care of myself and get out of the way, and I'm going to walk all over you. That I don't think it's universal by a long shot, but I think that we are more impatient now, and I begin to believe that impatience is at least partly connected to an increased understanding that's not just here, but also here at this point, that our lives are really changed in permanent ways. And, where we have been saying, people like me have been saying for almost 2 years now, we can't go back, we can't go back. I think that that understanding has just taken root, and that's a real loss. That makes people angry. But one of the things I firmly believe is that anger is always a second order emotion, that all of our negative emotions, except anger, are depleting. They kind of leave me mush on the floor. If I'm embarrassed, if I'm sad, if I'm ashamed of myself, all of those are depleting experiences. But that if I add energy to any of those experiences, they look like anger. And so that, and in many ways, anger is easier to feel than any of those other feelings. Because when I'm angry, it's generally directed outside, and those other bad feelings are directed inside. And so I think that some of the anger that we're seeing is, the word is too strong, but a form of, in some sense, despair. But despair I refuse to feel. And so instead of despair, I choose anger. And for me, to understand that actually is quite liberating, because then I can look at that anger and begin to understand that it has greater depth than just nastiness. It makes people feel more human for me, and therefore more forgivable. You are all, by virtue of being leaders, you are all planners. You would not be in the positions that you are if you weren't planners, if you weren't people who looked towards the future and tried to create opportunities. And here we are in a time where planning is both necessary and useless. And so we are constantly kind of frustrated and excited and frustrated and excited. And I think that many of us are really kind of experiencing a time of whiplash, that as soon as I think I'm going in this direction, I'm actually going in that direction. And I think we have to be really kind to ourselves about that whiplash. Because the planning and replanning and canceling and reopening, it is making us all a little batty, and the having to hold what everybody wants from you The people who want you to open, the people who want you not to open, the people who want you to be socially distanced, the people who say, you can't come here with a cloth mask, you can't, there's too many opinions and not enough facts. And so I think we are all really struggling with that. What we're going to be talking about today is an arena of psychological research that's called post-traumatic growth. But before we get there, a couple of caveats. First of all, remember that not all trauma is negative. Not all trauma is negative. We believe in the psychological community that the impact and experience of becoming a parent for the first time is the psychological equivalent of having a parent die. That the experience of becoming a parent is such a dislocation. This is not true of subsequent children. It's really the first child. There's such a dislocation in identity and in my sense of who I am that that also constitutes a trauma. We might say for some people, and remember, one part of that definition that we had of the word trauma is that trauma is the response, right? It's not the event, it's the response. So there might be trauma that has to do with getting a new job. The job of your dreams actually might be traumatic. That part of trauma is the sense of disruption. And so that not all trauma is, this terrible thing happened to me. A lot of it has to do with a sense of disruption in my identity. So when we first started thinking about trauma and its impact, the research on the impact of trauma starts with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And the research on that really starts in great depth in the Vietnam era, but we see evidence of that in response to war in much earlier times. And the first time it really gets spoken about, there's clearly a lot of it that comes with soldiers post-Civil War. And we clearly see enormous impacts on communities that are discriminated against, whether it is African Americans in the South or the Japanese during the Second World War. But the research is done initially on soldiers, primarily soldiers in this country, primarily Vietnam vets. And they had enormous amounts of PTSD. We think that some of the reasons that they had such PTSD have to do with the particulars of that war. It is the first war in which soldiers were told to kill women and children. It is the first war where soldiers came home to an absolutely unwelcoming country, where soldiers would get off airplanes in country here and would be spit on immediately by people in airports. And it is also the first war where soldiers came home not in platoons, but individually, so that the person with whom I might be able to talk about my experience was still in Vietnam. The other members of my platoon were not with me, and so that people came home really isolated and were very much discouraged from talking about their experiences. There is tangent. There is some old research out of Israel. I'm not sure if it still really applies, but that looks at people who have experienced a trauma in emergency rooms and assesses whether or not people are better served by talking about the trauma when they're in the emergency room, so really immediately, or not talking about the trauma. And one of the things that research showed, and it's probably 40 years old, is that that each of us knows whether or not we should talk about it. That actually my instincts about whether or not I should share my experiences are more important than people in the aggregate. right? So there's some of us who would say, no, I'm not ready to talk about it, and we should let them not talk about it. And some who say, I need to talk about it right now, and we should let them talk about it. But coming out of Vietnam, we had soldiers who really didn't have opportunities to talk about it, whether or not they wanted to, because they were unwelcomed in the United States, and our VA system was really not equipped to handle the kinds of issues that people were seeing. In the 80s and 90s, we started looking at a group of people who come out of trauma and actually can say to themselves, I'm better off for this. Not I would have chosen the trauma, but I actually can see ways in which I have grown and gotten stronger after post-trauma. And so what you and I are going to talk about this afternoon is what kind of arenas of post-traumatic growth exist as we, at least in theory, in research. I think it is important for us to note that much of the research was originally done with soldiers, and that it wasn't until the women's movement that we began to understand that there were non-war traumas that had the same kinds of impact as war. It was not until we really started, people really started talking about the impact of rape, which is, of course, much more common than it should be, and the kinds of trauma that rape can produce. But initially, when researchers were looking at trauma, they were really only looking at trauma in men and not the kind of equivalent trauma in women, both because most soldiers were men, and because we didn't think of individual trauma. We thought of communal trauma, or group trauma. And so some of our understanding of trauma has changed as we begin to understand that it is actually experienced differently by different genders and by different individuals. So I want to parse for you the difference between growth and resilience. I think this is important for us to understand. Resilience resilience is really much more bounce back than growth. So remember when they said we're going to go into a 2-week lockdown, and we all said, how am I ever going to survive that? That was a very long time ago. Had we had simply a 2-week lockdown, we would have been able to be resilient. We would have returned to the people we were, and we would not have been changed in profound ways. Those of us who had lost people would still be changed by that loss, but it would have been much more normative. Growth is actually painful. Resilience doesn't necessarily leave scars. Growth leaves scars. And that's an important distinction for us to draw. It's important because growth is transformative. I am a different person if after I grow. I am not a different person when I'm resilient. We tend to use these words interchangeably. I think that weakens both of them. And so I need them to be seen separately. So when I am resilient, I am the person I was before. But when I grow, I have been stretched. I've experienced pain. I may not think of it as being terribly painful, but I experienced something that is painful, and I am different. So think about this as building muscles. That the way we build muscles is that we stress our muscles and then we rest our muscles. And if I stress and rest, the muscle gets stronger and bigger. That's growth. That's growth. But notice that part of growth is rest. And that's also an important thing for us to be thinking about right now, because we're now in month 22, and for many of us, there hasn't been a real sense of rest. And I think that's really an important thing for us to be thinking about, both in ourselves and in the people we serve. And I have been thinking about this one aspect of rest a lot recently, which is that when you are working in your office, in whatever central location you are, my guess is that you work for a while and then you stand up and you go get a drink of water, or you go get a cup of coffee, or you look out the window, or you check the mail, or you go to the bathroom, or you walk out of your office and say to somebody near you, "It's so cold in here." We don't work continuously. Nobody does that. But in COVID, particularly when we are on these hourly Zooms, we are working continuously. We are not having those rest experiences. And I would suggest to you, though I will not do this to you today, I would suggest to you that a 50-minute Zoom, you can get as much done in a 50-minute Zoom as you can in a 60-minute Zoom, I promise you. And that 10 minutes of reset may actually make you more effective all through the day. A friend who is a pediatric nurse says to me that when she leaves the room of a child, she goes to wash her hands, as of course she has to, and she says, "I am washing that pain off so I can hold the next pain." That reset is really important for us, and frankly, I think it's really important for us to name it as reset. So if you go to a meeting for 50 minutes and then check your email for 10, that does not count. That is not resetting. That is just coming up with another chore. So if you go to a meeting for 50 minutes and then you play Words with Friends, you may very well be resetting. And that, so think about what is a reset for you. For me, the reset is almost always I have to open the back door and breathe. The reset is actually important. So when we think about growth requires some discomfort. That's just the way humans are built. It requires that the stressors actually challenge our personal worldview, or our view of ourselves in the world. And I think there's no question that this experience, this last 22 months, has challenged both our views of ourselves and our views of the world. I think that we have been challenged vis-a-vis our understanding of what it means to be in community. What does a community actually do for itself and for its members? I think it has challenged our views of government. I think there's many ways in which we have been challenged. And it is, I think, important for us to understand that challenge is a precursor to growth. So the researchers come up with 6 arenas. They believe of post-traumatic growth. They believe they are truly siloed. In my brain, they are not siloed. I can't really parse them as perfectly as the theoreticians do. So I will give you them, and I will try to give you some examples with them. But you'll see pretty quickly that for me, there's a lot of overlap between these 6 arenas. And so in no particular order, these are the 6 arenas. I do want to suggest to you, actually, before I say what they are, that when I think about these 6 arenas, I think of them as things that in my work, that I have the opportunity to help grow these arenas in other people. And that's actually what's important about them, is not that they exist, but that I can, through my behavior and my teaching, help scaffold this kind of growth. So I can take a textual story and use it to demonstrate growth. And that right now, I think for most of us, part of our job is to help scaffold growth in other people. And so I'm thinking about these arenas as the places where I should be putting my attention vis-a-vis scaffolding growth. Does that make sense before I go on? Because I want to make sure that idea is English. Okay. All right. So there's the 6 arenas in no particular order. And if somebody wants to put them in the chat box, it will be helpful to you all to have them there. But you don't have to if you're, however it's useful to you. And not, again, not in any particular order. The first one is an awareness of my personal strengths that I begin to understand through traumatic experiences, actually what I am good at. Thank you, Sue. What I am good at, what capabilities I have, what capacities I have. I might, and this can be really meaningful things, and it can be utterly trivial things. That, for example, Michelle Obama learned how to knit. That is a new personal strength. It's not a terribly meaningful one. Even to me, I'm a knitter, but it is not a terribly meaningful personal strength. But I might also have learned that I have a capacity for kindness that I didn't know about, or that is bigger than I knew about. I might learn that I am more patient than I thought. I might learn that I am less patient than I thought. I think probably all of us have learned that to some degree. I might learn that that I have. I personally learned that this environment for teaching was not beyond me. I would never have guessed that I could do this over technology, and I learned that I could do this. So, if you would take a minute and think about what examples there are in you or in someone else of an increased awareness of personal strength. By the way, nobody gets all 6 of these. So you're not, you don't get an A at post-traumatic growth. And if you're good at one of these arenas, it's not that you finish it, it's that you're on the path, because on the path is the skill. So give me ideas of kinds of increased awareness of personal strengths that people might have, that you might have.
I was just going to type, one of the things I became aware of is I'm much more of an introvert than I thought I was. Being by myself was not only important, but it was good.
Yeah. So 2 things about introverts. We have learned over the course of the pandemic that there are semi-introverts and real introverts. So they're the people who are really loving this. I don't have to deal with other people much at all, except in these kind of distant ways. And then there are the people who thought they were introverts, but are actually starving for other human beings. And both exist. The other aspect of this that I think is important for us, particularly as we have moments of re-entering the world, is that most, if not all of us, have lost significant social skills. And one of the things not all of us, many of us were good at was small talk and kind of irrelevant conversations. And that's a skill that I actually think has really been deteriorating for most of us. And so that we're going to have to relearn how to re-engage with other people. Driving, absolutely. The response to emergencies is a really interesting one. That what you learned was that crisis works for you. And for some of us, we learned that crisis doesn't work for us. And that's, and if I know this about myself, that crisis works for me, I might actually then try to create opportunities to not be in this kind of crisis, but to be in some kind of crisis, because I might be more, that might actually use my skills better. I think that's a really wonderful insight. That people can pivot, that people can thrive with uncertainty. Most of us try to make our lives relatively predictable. And one of the things I think some of us learned, particularly at the beginning of COVID, is I don't need it to be that predictable. I think now people are feeling a greater need for predictability because of the whiplash, but agreed. So things that I thought about myself that were wrong, strengths that I have now. So that's the first arena. Second arena is a reprioritization of values, that I actually begin to think about what truly matters to me, that I can have compassion for people I profoundly disagree with. That's, boy, that is a strength we all need right now. more than ever. And one that I think we're going to all have to really work on as we find our ways into the next normal. So in reprioritization of values, what we begin to think about is what actually really matters to me, as opposed to what am I told is supposed to matter to me. Because a lot of the way we live our values has to do with how we want to present ourselves to the world. But one of the things that happens as we recover from and absorb and digest difficult situations is that I begin to understand these things don't matter to me at all. I don't care about those things. These are the things I care about. And as I understand what really matters, it doesn't have to be a universal value. It can be simply, these are the things that I personally care about. And some of those are personal and some of those are communal. I care about community. One of the things that I've learned in COVID is how important I think community is for the mental health, for the wellness of all of us. Human beings don't do well in utter isolation. And I think we've also learned, I think so much of the last almost 2 years has been us learning about the impact, the ways in which privilege blinds us. And that is, again, gives us the opportunity to reprioritize our values, because privilege blinds us. And it blinds us in ways we aren't even aware of. So again, I want to ask you, are there ways in which you think your values have changed? Has there been a sense of centering of particular values? Not that it's a value that wasn't there before, but a value that has expanded and now takes up more space in your value set.
I've noticed that with a lot of folks that there's just a renewed sense to be closer to family amongst
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the interesting things when the vaccines were readily available, most airplane travelers are business people. And we know that when vaccines were immediately available, that most airplane travelers were people going to see family and friends. A clear value change, making more connections with friends, being in relationship. I actually would argue that for many of us, there's also been a prioritization of depth relationships, that I'm much more interested in having meaningful conversations than I am in having conversations. And that's, again, a change in values. Okay, number three. Number three is our relationships with others. If you're not values driven, you're diminished in value, in worth, which I think is a really interesting thing, and it is another way in which we reprioritize our values. That action, the action of reprioritizing values, does not mean that all my values go up. It means some of them go up and some of them go down. There are things that I used to think mattered, or people I used to think mattered, that matter less to me. So that takes us to the third one, which is in our relationships with others. What we see in people with post-traumatic growth in this arena is an increase in both compassion and altruism. Those are different. Compassion is in the I thou moment, when it is between individuals. Compassion is between individuals, and altruism is between an individual and a cause. So for example, if I am walking down the street in Manhattan and I see a homeless person and I give them money, food, a hat, whatever, that's compassionate. It's compassionate if I do it in a respectful way. It's not compassionate if I do it in a disrespectful way. But if I were going to be altruistic, I might do work with a homeless organization. So compassion is between you and me, and altruism is between me and society, or me and a cause. We also see that people shed irrelevant relationships. I think probably all of us have had that experience in COVID, that there are people who I spent time with and I'm not picking up the phone to call because they really weren't as important as I thought they were, or potentially they acted like they were. And an increased value on both having and being social support. So you may find that and so now think about what I just said about what people flew for last spring when we could first feel safe on airplanes. That's an example of increasing the value of those most important relationships. Who did I really want to see? Who did I really want to talk to? Who did I do the work to maintain the relationship? And who did I let slide? I would not judge people for letting people slide at all. I think that is really part of the trauma. I think we also see that after a death, that there are people who move closer and there are people that move further away. And it is the same kind of shift. So you may find that your particular community is doing more for certain groups of people or other groups of people. That's altruism. It may also be compassion. And those things are ways in which we see post-traumatic growth. Okay, number 4 is in appreciation of life. In the sense of being blessed and being aware of our blessings. For some of us, this happens in nature. For some of us, this happens in relationship. For Idalia, it happened on Christmas Eve. And when she saw her people treating each other with honor, and caring for each other, and being able to share an experience of joy in a way which was safe and respectful. That's an appreciation of life. It may be that this happens when the first crocus blooms or when the first snow falls. Those are both those moments for me. I think as we slowed down, as many of us did, slowing down is not the same thing as having less to do. We had more to do, but I think we slowed down. As we slow down, we get an increased appreciation of life. One of the things that I think is really striking, and this is going to lead me into the next arena, I think though these appreciation of life moments, these sense of being blessed moments are often spontaneous. They are, I don't think they are as often planned. I think that it is hard to create a moment and say, now I'm going to have an oh my goodness moment. They happen to me. I think they often happen to me when I'm more relaxed, when I am more available. But I think they're actually quite difficult to plan. And that leads me, actually, let me take a break and ask you if you can think of appreciation of life moments that have happened for you or for somebody around you in the pandemic. Came a grandmother for the 4th time, and that was one of those.
I think back to maybe April, May of 2020, and all 4 of our daughters were at home, ranging from ages 13 through 20. And that could possibly be a recipe for disaster. But instead, there was a ton of sister laughter.
So one of the really interesting things that we saw coming out of summer camps this summer, particularly sleepaway camps, was the extraordinary depth of relationship between siblings. Extraordinary depth of relationships between siblings. Look, that's who they had. And my guess is that we will see long-term implications, long-term impacts, excuse me, of this time on who these kids are when they are adults. That your 4 daughters are probably going to be much closer adults than they might have been but for COVID. We wouldn't have chosen COVID, but what a blessing. And part of what makes it a blessing is noticing that it's a blessing. That the unnoticed blessings are less palpable, less powerful. That's a great example. Appreciation of life, singing in a congregation again. Yes. When I've taught a class about spirituality over the lifespan, and when I start the class, I ask everybody to think about what is a spiritual moment. And my particular one is not being on top of a mountain, but being in a kind of a desert environment in Israel, and just knowing there has to be something magical, because look where I am. And I think that so for you and for me, it clearly happens in nature. And cooking, absolutely. These are ways in which I began to see the complexities and gifts that the world had given me. So this leads me to the 5th arena. And remember, not everybody gets to do these, and nobody does them all, and nobody finishes with them, because post-traumatic growth implies growth, and growth is ongoing. That is what adults do, is we keep growing or we shrivel up. And this is in spiritual change and spiritual development. I want to parse for you, because it's not always, I want to make sure it's clear to you that for some people, spiritual change and development is about religious behavior. And for other people, it has nothing to do with religious behavior. And it's not, I don't want there to be a judgment that this is what happens when I am present for a liturgical moment. It can happen in all sorts of arenas. So when I was teaching this class on spirituality, and I asked students to tell me about a spiritual moment, they talked about things like being at rock concerts and baseball games and at the top of a mountain. And I want us to understand that spirituality can happen in all sorts of arenas. But part of what makes it spiritual is my labeling it as spiritual. That what I think ultimately, and I spent the entire semester with these students trying to define what spirituality was, even though that was the topic of the course. It was also the topic of the course. I think that what happens in spiritual experiences is that I begin to see myself as both incredibly small and incredibly large, that I am both central and tiny. And that can happen for people in church. It can happen for people in nature. It can happen for people at a Mets game, although I don't understand how it could ever happen at a Mets game because they're so terrible. It could happen for people looking at a sleeping child. It is really important for us to understand that I think what spiritual change and development has to do with it has to do with seeing myself as part of a whole, an important and yet potentially small part of a whole. And so I think that one of the real challenges for spiritual leaders in a time like this is to create multiple opportunities for us to multiple on-ramps to spirituality. And to understand that which works for me may not work for you, and that which works for you may not work for me. For a true foodie, there may be spirituality in the first bite of something delicious. And let's not say that's not valuable or worth it. And the sixth arena of post-traumatic growth is in creativity. This is the one I struggle with the most. I am not a creative person particularly. And so I think to myself when I'm trying to teach about this, what does that even mean? But I point out to you that that Beethoven composed the Ninth Symphony when he was completely deaf, and that some exquisite writing and art and music has come out of warfare, whether it's Picasso's Guernica or other kinds of examples of exquisite creativity that has been born out of human suffering. The Joan Didion's book, The Year of Living, now I can't remember the last word. It comes out of the trauma of the loss of her husband. The Year of Magical Thinking. That there are lots of ways in which creativity appears. Michael says creativity means bringing together existing elements and ideas in new and novel ways. Creativity is the artist for Guernica is Picasso. And hymns that come out of creativity and of loss. So creativity is one of the ways in which we absorb and grow through trauma, and one of the things we bring to the world as a response to trauma. All of these six, remember, nobody gets them all, and nobody gets to finish them. All of these six are ways in which we can support other people's growth. And I think in your work and in my work, the goal is to find ways to support other people and help them grow. Not just endure, but be changed by circumstances that demand change. For most of us, my guess is for none of us, has there been such a profound disruption in a communal way as the last 22 months. We've all had personal disruptions, but the communal disruption and the communal, the sense that the world is unpredictable, I don't think any of us have had anything quite like this. The question, I think, for us is how we make meaning going forward and how we make meaning now. Because at core, I think that meaning making is the job of humans. I think it's the thing that makes us human, is meaning making. And so the question for all of us going forward is how you can both personally in your work role, institutionally, help create and support and scaffold post-traumatic growth in the people and the institutions that you serve. Because that's the challenge that's in front of us right now. And I think that is the challenge potentially of the rest of our lives. Thoughts about this? What do you do with this information? What questions does it leave for you?
And in my synod, and I'm sure others are doing this too, I find that connecting our common experience to scripture in metaphor helps people bear it. And the whole wilderness experience of the Israelites, they came out differently than they went in. They grumbled and complained. They weren't their best selves. Moses got tired. And there's other ways of bringing it to kind of creating this narrative, biblical and theological context, which puts our current experience into a people of God experience.
Absolutely. I would add to that Moses on the mountain, that that we don't always know when we will encounter God.
I'll add that in the next article I write.
Good.
Or something like it, because they were never so close to God. They were never so dependent on God, and they were never so resentful of God.
Absolutely.
And so this pulling and pushing of faith, that's, I think, is important to name.
Exactly. And I think that if we expect people to have untested faith, we're actually not expecting anything that's particularly sophisticated. Tested faith is a really different experience than untested faith. I would rather have tested faith. Bishop Felix asks, are these areas of growth that can happen, may happen, can be fostered, one or all of the above, all of the above? And not everybody has post-traumatic growth. And I think more than fostered, I would say scaffolded. I think you can give people opportunities to think about them. This is in the you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And some of us are looking for growth opportunities, and some of us are not. It's hard to force growth on people, which is to say, no, you can't force growth on people. Circumstances can, but I don't know that we can. So how do you use this information? Aside from Bishop Catherine's writing an article.
I think for me, the normalizing piece of everything, whether it's the growth or what people are dealing with, that's the part that's most helpful. And so I'm spending a good amount of time with our roster of ministers, our clergy, talking about it.
Normalizing growth and normalizing pain and normalizing loss. I think that probably all of you have been in the situation where you are working with a mourner and you explain to them what the kind of experience of mourning is, and the dumb things we do when we're mourning, and the confusion when we're mourning, and you normalize the mourning, M-O-U-R-N, excuse me, and it makes it less scary. It is important we are all better off if we're less afraid. Fear does not help us. It may protect us, but it doesn't help us grow. Well, I want to thank you all. It was wonderful to be back with you. It was wonderful to be with you the first time. It was wonderful to be back with you. Please let me know if I can be helpful to any of you.